Welcome to the IoT podcast show. I'm your host, Tom White. Today we are joined by Suhail Khan. Suhail is the Director of Development and Programming at Huawei and works entirely in the IoT space. Very focused on the smart home. We're super excited to understand more about what Huawei is doing when it comes to IoT. Welcome to the show, Suhail.
It's a pleasure to be here, Tom.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you, and I know that you've just come off another conference, haven't you, in Paris? So very precious your time is, and it's really nice to hear a little bit more about yourself and Huawei. So, for people that don't know who you are, Suhail, could you talk a little bit about your background in IoT and how it is you became a director within development at Huawei?
Yeah, sure. So my journey with IoT or Internet of Things started much before it was a thing, way back in 2010, while I was working for a French company and we were working on SCADA systems. So SCADA systems are known as the grandfather of IoT because they do the monitoring work pretty well, but they don't really have a control plane or a data plane. And that's when I came across IoT for the first time while I was researching the Gartner hype cycle. And back then it was just a buzzword. But a few years later, I got my first shot at IoT while I was working on a European Union research project in Austria. Again, from a context of energy grids, gathering data from your different nodes in the grid, optimizing your electric vehicle payloads, optimizing your household energy consumption, and so on. But my real touch point with consumer IoT or smart home was about 4 years ago at another energy utility, a big one in Europe, that was building out its own smart home products, and particularly a smart home gateway system which could connect to multiple sensors. And this was my first touch point where I worked on IoT end to end. So, which means from your hardware to the cloud to the end user application,
Yeah.
right? And so that was a few years ago. And since last year, I've been working as the director of development, programming, and engineering at Huawei, focusing mainly on IoT products again. But here, it's all in one. So I'm working on smart home devices, smart home appliances, healthcare IoT devices, audiovisual IoT devices. So it's a great opportunity at Huawei, and the technology that we are working on is quite interesting as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And that's a great overview. And obviously, over 10 years now, working
Yeah,
in what we now call IoT. But interesting to know you came from a SCADA systems point of view.
yeah,
It's curious to see because a lot of people have seen this transition from various fields, from machine to machine, from devices, pay TV industry, but also yours from SCADA and also energy and grid, right? I remember
yeah,
many years ago I was working with sensorless networks on an original smart meter using very early stage Zigbee protocols, and
yeah,
we now see that in the market, and we now see that very popular. But back then it was something that was really quite cutting edge. So yeah,
yeah.
curious to see that. So within Huawei in particular, then Suhail, do multiple different facets, multiple different use cases and R&D. What sort of innovations have you been working on that you can speak about, of course, publicly, that really has got you excited?
Yeah, well, Tom, so right now the technology that I'm most excited about is our operating system called as Harmony OS. And it also has its open source flavor called as Open Harmony. It's a project that started within Huawei a few years ago in 2016, and it has its roots in open source because Huawei has been traditionally a big contributor to open source projects. So you might be surprised, but last year we were the top contributor to the Linux kernel, right? And Huawei also has its roots in contributing a lot of code to the Android open source project as well.
Wow,
So
I didn't know that.
yeah,
That's really curious. In fact, later on this afternoon, I'm actually going to a barbecue with some old mates of mine from uni, and a number of them are contributors to the Linux kernel and work
yeah,
in open source environments for companies like Lenaro and other
yeah.
businesses. But I never knew that Huawei was one of the top contributors. That's really
We are,
curious. Yeah.
and in fact, we partnered with Lenaro earlier this year,
Yeah.
for the open source Harmony OS as well. So yeah, we contribute quite heavily there.
Yeah.
But now coming back to the reason why I'm so excited about this, because it's an operating system which is like no other, right? Because it can run on really small microcontrollers to really large multimedia heavy devices with many gigabytes of RAM,
Yeah.
right? And to top it all off, from a user point of view, we are building some really innovative use cases on top of that. For example, pairing, controlling, and automating your smart home devices with one touch and running your end user applications on multiple devices at the same time. And this whole seamless device collaboration user journey makes it quite interesting as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's fantastic. Obviously, this
Yeah.
is widely spoken about. I mean, clearly, operating systems and bespoke operating systems for enabling various IoT use cases are very important. In your view, Sahel, what are the most important factors of creating a robust, fit for purpose operating system for a specific IoT device?
Yeah, well, operating systems are the heart of any IoT product because it supports the bare minimum infrastructure you need, such as your communication drivers, your kernel, and most importantly, the compiler upon which you can run your business logic, which is unique to your product. And at the same time, operating systems are also the most complex component because on one hand, it enables you with the bare minimum infrastructure, and on the other hand, it really takes a lot of time, effort, and money to make your OS functional, adaptable, and upgradable, right? And also secure. So most of the companies in IoT fail because they do not have a clear long-term maintenance strategy of their OS, nor are they able to grasp the complexities that come with the development of different modules on your hardware, right? So if I had to pick the most important factors or questions every company needs to ask themselves before they pick an OS, so the first one would be how easily can I build my business logic applications on this particular operating system? How future-proof is this OS? Does it follow the latest trends for computing and processing information on the edge? How would my long-term maintenance strategy look like? How expensive can it get? Does it follow any open source standards? Because right now, all the companies are going in the open source direction, right? Because the open governance model is important for OEMs to work with so that they are not in a vendor lock-in. And finally, it's about what kind of unique scalable use cases does this operating system offer, right?
Just
Yeah.
yeah, I mean that's a very important reason, and just for our listeners that may not particularly understand the importance of open source, aside of open governments and non-vendor lock-in, and presumably cost as well. What other reasons are there to support this open source initiative when it comes to creation of operating systems?
So for as an OEM, it makes sense because it takes away a lot of software burden from your shoulders, right? You get to focus on your hardware because that's more important to you. Whereas most of the software is coming from a community of quality developers. And then there is also the fact that most of the open source projects are backed by really big open source foundations, organizations, and big companies such as Huawei. And yeah, so you can expect some good quality source code coming out of an open source project. And at the same time, you can expect standards being defined, which can be widely used across the industry, across multiple devices. And as an open source contributor, you can take the open source project in whatever direction you want it to go to, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think from a wider perspective, and going back to engineers that I know, because you may not know this, but I know some of our listeners have. And I probably mentioned this too many times on the podcast, but my background was in kernel engineering and embedded Linux. That's what I studied at university. And from an open source perspective, the fact that someone is writing a patch or someone has peer reviewed that code, and then you have that, not so much that one-upmanship, but being able to fix something and check that it's right, that works really well, and almost lends itself quite well to that of an engineer. The fact that something has been tested and thoroughly tested and tested and tested again, and I think that's one of the main
Yeah.
benefits with the community. Would you agree, Sahel?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And this is why community-led projects have been so successful over the years. And almost all of the companies in the industry are switching towards open source projects as their
Yeah,
base,
yeah, absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just touching back onto some of the initiatives that you're in charge of and that you're handling within Huawei, I'd like to talk a little bit more about smart homes, if I may. What sort of scalable use cases have you seen within smart home deployments that you know, believe will become the most widely used, either now or in the future?
Well, I love this question, Tom,
Yeah,
because
well, it's a good job I
I'm a
chose it
huge
then, isn't
advocate.
it?
Yeah, I'm a huge advocate of smart home, and I have about 50 smart home
Wow.
devices in my
I hope they're
house.
all
And
Huawei.
yeah, yeah, yes, we have quite a lot of smart home devices across multiple segments. Well, you have your entertainment segment, and I think this has blown up quite a bit in the last few years. In terms of scalable use cases, I definitely see that smart speakers will continue to attract new customers as they will provide many more additional services on top of what they do today, right? You can in the future have the possibility to do your shopping much more easily from a smart speaker. You can create your shopping lists, you can get your latest news, and so on. And they will also influence the sale of other products in your house. So, for example, we can see smart speakers working directly embedded on a smart home appliance, right? And yeah, we'll see a use case trend where devices with individual functionalities will be more or less nullified. Rather, you would have one single super device which does it all. And this is exactly what we are focusing at Huawei with Harmony OS. By the way, one such obvious example of devices converging functionalities could be the Smart Home Hub, where the hub is not just a smart home device aggregator, but it is also an internet router at the same time. This way, you have lesser gateways in your household. So if you look at the number of gateways I have in my house because of all the smart home devices, it looks like a server room with many tangled wires. And yeah, so lastly, but and most importantly, right, we will see the healthcare domain dominate the industry in the coming years, mostly because of the COVID situation. Right now, people are more health conscious. So we'll see an upward trend in healthcare centric smart home devices. For example, my team just built a use case with a French smart home robotic company where a person with underlying health conditions has his or her health data monitored constantly. And in case of an emergency, the robot would automatically place a call to the emergency services or to a family member, right? And security is an evergreen smart home use case because people, of course, want to protect their homes.
Mm,
Yeah,
mm. I think, yeah, I think the notion of it being a hub and it being a singular converged device rather than these individual silos is an obvious one and a very good one, and
yeah,
can clearly see why Huawei is working towards that. Because I think in terms of buy-in from a user point of view, you don't have all these devices taking up plug sockets in your home, and that they, you have a central point. And when you're looking at from an access point of view as well, you look at adaptive Wi-Fi, and the fact that these can double up as doing that is fantastic. Um, and that's really good to see. And I think from a smart home perspective, that's been one of the issues in the past.
yeah,
That you look at, for instance, Connect Four, for instance, which was a really well used system in media entertainment, uh, IP, CCTV systems, etc. You used to have big racks, right? And then
yeah.
all of the devices, and then everything else, and it's just like it takes up space. But equally, from an updating point of view, if you've got a singular device, perhaps 2 3 years time, you can update that quite quickly, as opposed to having 50 devices
Yeah.
that will look kind of outdated fairly easily, right? So perhaps there's other benefits in there, and that's fantastic to see.
There's always the point that it's also easier to automate one single device rather than trying to automate multiple devices at the same time. We see the issues that come out of the typical rule engines in the market. Because for a technical user, it's fine. You can always script your automation use case. But for a non-tech savvy user, automating your devices, creating scenarios, and creating rules for them could get really complex in,
Yeah,
in
yeah,
this case. Yeah,
yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, that's
yeah.
fantastic. And just on that note, in terms of the future, I'm really keen to know your view on this whole topic, sorry, of IoT and tech for good. So for me, and this is quite a personal view that I have, but IoT in essence is usually for good. It's
Yeah.
usually for the enrichment of people's lives in some form or another. Security, media, entertainment, health, utilities. We're seeing a lot of devices now coming out after the pandemic, be that proximity sensors on wearables, to UVC lighting based systems for disinfection of air and pollutants. What is your thought on IoT and tech for good? And the burning question is, can it always be good, Sahel?
Well, Tom, these philosophical questions are my favorite, right?
Okay.
Well, first of all, I've always used social media and the fintech industries as a benchmark for IoT, right? And IoT being the youngest of them all, but all of them have to deal with sensitive data of the users, right? But the major difference here is that IoT is growing by evolution rather than revolution. What I mean by that is fintech and social media exploded onto the scene mostly because of peer pressure. For example, if you don't use digital banking for payments, people would ask you to go back and live in your cave. Or if you never used social media to communicate with people or express your thoughts virtually, people would say the same thing, right? So there was always this constant peer pressure to use these different technologies, but it's
Mm,
not the same in case of IoT or smart home. The majority of IoT users these days are still early adopters and tech enthusiasts, right? So the growth in IoT has been very organic and being done through extensive user research and building a stronger base for the technology, right? And being an IoT advocate, I would say it is for the good. It will change the way people live their lives. It would enable better security for their houses. It would enable better energy standards as well. Your devices would consume lesser energy. And at the same time, the whole entertainment and comfort factor that IoT brings through its entertainment devices like smart speakers and so on is the icing on the cake uh, when it comes to this. So yeah, definitely, IoT is for the good. The industry is still growing, and I just see an upward trend here,
Yeah,
especially with people staying more at home. They want to experiment uh, with how they live, and yeah, I
yeah.
definitely see an upward trend in the IoT and the smart home industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I think certainly we touched upon the pandemic just now. People staying at home, people wanting to invest more in their homes,
Yeah,
buying more equipment, buying more gizmos, gadgets, and certainly having an increased amount of time from an entertainment perspective, etc., is something that a trend that's going to be set to continue. I
yeah,
mean, there's lots of figures. I mean, you mentioned Gartner, where you read early Gartner reports about IoT, and there's several others. Um, McKinsey and Company, various publications that have gone out about the growth of IoT,
yeah.
and and yet, a question that does come up is that we're still not at that point where it's as big as it's predicted to be, or there has been some delay, or there's been some reason for that. Do you have any thoughts on that in particular about why aren't we in an infinitely connected world right now? Has there been a reason for the delay, or where do you see this really going as well?
Uh, the reason for this delay is because of the trust issue, right? Because it is super sensitive data in your household. People find it hard to trust technology sometimes. This is why we can see a trend in IoT in the future where there'll be more devices which are running purely on the edge, right? And this, yeah, this in my opinion will help accelerate the growth in IoT. And of course, there was also a major challenge about interoperability between devices, right? It is still one of the main weaknesses that's there in the entire market and in the connectivity segment. And but we've seen some recent projects and coming out of the open source community again, which are led by some really big organizations. For example, the launch of Matter, formerly known as Connected Home over IP, or CHIP. I guess CHIP didn't matter. So so yeah, we'll see an upward trend in these interoperability technologies, which help with seamless device connectivity among
Yeah.
multiple devices. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. That's a really really good insight. So, Hel, thank you so much for joining us on the IoT podcast show. It's been amazing to have you here, and especially to take the time out. I know you're an incredibly busy man. Really appreciate it. Where can people find out more online about what Huawei is doing in IoT? Certainly within the operating system. What sort of form of social media can they go and look at to find out more about this?
Well, firstly, for all the open source developers out there, they can have a look at our GitLab uh, project called as gitlab.ostc.org, where you can find most of the interesting projects that we are doing with the open source community together with organizations such as Linaro. Then there is a broad overview on Harmony OS, which can be found on device.harmonyos.com. And of course, we have our own internal Huawei developer community. So you just head to developer.huawei.com and you can interact with other developers who are building really use cool use cases by using our operating system and the different SDKs that we have.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sahel. It's been great having you here.
Thanks, Tom. It was a pleasure.
And if you'd like to find out more about the IoT podcast show, please follow the link in the comments. Get involved in the conversation about Huawei, smart home, tech for good. Subscribe to the newsletter. We are regularly producing more podcasts, as you can see, and we'd love to see you there and on the next episode.